Hi. Last video, we went over what you see on the right side of the screen right now, questions raised by Genesis 6, 1-4. And we just went over the questions because there are so many that took us the whole time of a regular video. So today I'm not going to go through the questions again, but I'm going to try, if not provide answers, at least provide some insights or the range of options that scholars today offer in trying to interpret some of these challenging aspects of this passage. So let's just jump right in. So as we see, the first question is, how are these verses connected with the book of the Toledot of Adam in Genesis 5, or what follows in Genesis 6, 5 and following? And what's at issue there is Genesis 6, 1-4 simply an insertion that has nothing to do with the rest of the story, put in by some later editor because they liked it for whatever reason, an excerpt from some other mythology that's lost, or something like that. But to help us see, at least what I think are clues that is tightly integrated, regardless of what its original situation was, let's look at this. So we see this is a connection here between four different characters. Enoch, the Bene Ha-Elohim, which is the Hebrew for the sons of God, we'll look at in a minute, Noah, and Yahweh. So we see in 524, back in the Toledot of Adam that we'd looked at 2 sessions ago, Enoch walked with God. And we see in what follows, in the introduction of what almost all scholars and interpreters would say is the flood narrative itself, Noah walked with God. That's a rare phrase, and so here it is twice, making a connection between Enoch and Noah here as two characters who walked with God. An ancient biblical expression for being faithful. Then we see a connection after that between Enoch and the Bene Ha-Elohim. And what's important here is if 6, 1-4 is non-P, or what used to be called the Yahweh's text, because as you can see, Lord in caps there, it has Yahweh in it, but the Enoch text is not, then somebody has made this connection, or at least the connection is there to be made. And so we see it this way. Enoch describes that God took him, taking from earth to the sky. So Enoch living on the earth is taken up to be where God is. And then in the book of Enoch, as we can see right here, Enoch is in the heavens where he has the visions that become the book of Enoch as we have it now. And then from the opposite direction, the Bene Elohim took women, taking from the sky to the earth. Part of that, the taking from the sky to the earth, depends upon whether we equate the Bene Ha-Elohim with the Nephilim in verse 4. We'll get to that question in a little bit. But one of the issues is Nephilim can come from the Hebrew verb meaning to fall, so the fallen ones. So Enoch is one who's lifted up from the earth to the sky, and the Nephilim are ones who fall down, and that will be taken up in the first book of Enoch's interpretation of these as angels, as fallen angels, as we'll see in a couple of minutes. So, plainly, there's a taking, a positive taking of a man who walked with God, taken up to be with God, and what appears to be an imperial or at least patriarchal taking of these sons of God taking women. Let's move on a little further to see further connections here between the Bene Ha-Elohim and Yahweh. So the Bene Ha-Elohim look out and they see or saw that the women were good, Hebrew Tov. Yahweh, though, in just a few verses down, 6:5, I didn't mark it as 6:5 there, but that's where it is, saw that the evil of humanity was great, using the Hebrew ra'at, which is closely related to ra, which we saw in 2:9, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So the Bene Ha-Elohim look out and see something good, and Yahweh looks out and sees that what humanity is doing is evil. So a sharp contrast there, connecting us back with the Garden of Eden story, one of several connections we'll see back to that. And then finally in this unit, what we're going to look at, Noah, we were told in 529, shall bring humanity relief or comfort from the Hebrew nachem, from the PL stem, and not to get into the grammatical details, but it is important to recognize that Hebrew verbs have several stems, which is to say several different formations, and they can mean very different things in that. So the PL stem of nachem means relief or comfort, but the Nephal stem, which is in the mouth of Yahweh in 6:6 and 6:7, has to do with being sorry or to have regret. So the same word used in an opposite expression, that Noah somehow is going to bring something good to humanity, and Yahweh is sorry or regrets that humanity was even made. So a lot of ways in which wherever 6:1-4 came from, they've been those verses have been deeply integrated into the story as it unfolds. Both the Toledot that we saw before and the flood story about to emerge. On the second question on the right side of the chart, you can see the issue is the relationship between these verses and the Garden of Eden story. This is easier because the Garden of Eden story is understood to be a non-P or Yahweh's text, using Yahweh. And we looked at this a little bit last time, and as you can see just in the way I framed the question there under 2a, both use the verbs for see, good, and take. Resulting in some kind of limitation, which goes to one of the questions down below, but I'll address it right now. Back in 322, we saw that the humans are protected from taking from the tree of life and are expelled from the garden. Here, Yahweh has an internal reflection you see in verse 3, my spirit shall not abide or remain. We'll look at that word in a minute. And so some kind of limitation on human immortality, grasping for immortality. So in both these situations, a seeing, taking, a seeing as something is good and a taking leads to some condition on human mortality and the denial of human immortality. So who are these Bnei Ha-Elohim? We'll look at question 3 and 4 at the same time. How should it be translated, and what are they? Literally, the term can mean sons of God, but as we mentioned last time, the Hebrew Elohim can also be an adjective for powerful. The question of plural or singular has to do with Elohim as a plural word, and with the in front of it, it's specified as opposed to Yahweh Elohim, Lord God, where it's clearly referring to a single God with an adjective of divine power. So one might call it the mighty God, or the Lord in that sense. Lord is one who practices power over others. Sons of the gods could suggest an earlier time from before monotheism, and some scholars imagine that this is about. There's no evidence one way or another. Or the sons of the one God, not named as Yahweh here. What does that mean exactly, though? We didn't see that in the creation story in Genesis 1 or Genesis 2. So some other form of existence that came to be in some other way. That seems surprising, but there it is. How do we interpret what they are? Are they, as the most literal sense of it is, other gods, in the sense of sons of Elohim would be like the sons of the prophets, which is to say they are also prophets. The sons of Israel are Israelites. So in that sense, the sons of a god wouldn't be humans who have been given authority by God or gods, but actual divine creatures of some kind themselves. Since the earlier Israelites had a sense of multiple gods, but practiced henotheism to worship the one God, that is certainly a possibility. But later, certainly by the time of Genesis itself, Yahweh is the only God, the creator of heaven and earth, and so it would be the children of the one God, which made many readers uncomfortable. And so as we'll jump down to the last of our questions, how is Genesis 6:1-4 understood in later Jewish texts, especially in 1st Enoch, which we looked at a little bit last time? That's where we see the angels idea here in 4b, that these are angels, simply called sons of God. They just decide to call them angels, or as the book of Enoch will call them, watchers. Later interpretations, interestingly, by early Christians, a couple hundred years after the first part of the first book of Enoch, understood this as a contest between descendants of Seth and descendants of Cain. But as scholars say, there's nothing in the text to support that, and it's not even clear why early Christian authors would move away from the Enoch perspective and try to come up with this alternative interpretation. The D option is the one taken up in Genesis Rabbah, which is, say, the Midrash gathered together in the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era. And that's partly based on the connection between what we see in 6:1-4 and we see in the Nimrod story. So let's look at the other half of this here. So we here this is connecting our passage with chapter 10. So the Nephilim in the New Revised Standard, as you can see on the left side, are called heroes. The Hebrew is Gibborim, another plural there. Nimrod, a little later in chapter 10, it's described as a mighty warrior, in the same word, singular, Gibbor. And then as a mighty hunter, Gibbor Sa'id. Sa'id is the word for hunter, and there Gibbor is used as an adjective for mighty. But note, in mighty warrior is one word. So the Gibbor there are described described as men of the name. As you see, the Nephilim are described as men of the name here in 6:4, and the Babel people are trying to make a name for themselves. So to the extent the Nephilim are related to the sons of God, we'll come back to that question in a moment. Are they the same as them or their children? If you treat them as the same as the rabbis seem to have done, that would suggest that they are human warriors from ancient times, powerful people who would be able to take women like kings do, as we see in texts like 1 Samuel 8, or in Genesis texts like Genesis 34, where Shechem, the prince of the local city, takes Jacob's daughter Dinah, rapes her, and then wants to make her his wife. Could be read either way, but the earliest was as angels, and then later as powerful humans. Interesting, scholars nowadays tend to focus around the angelic interpretation. And what did they see when they looked? The translation we see here in verse 2 says the sons of God saw they were fair. I hinted at this last time that scholars argue over this vociferously. I'll show you a little bit of my notes here where we see Van Wolde and Carol Kaminsky, two feminist scholars, but not arguing on feminist grounds, use a word study of the Hebrew Tob and verbs that go along with that, and see this as morally good as opposed to good looking. A precise scholar like David Carr, though, suggests it's, quote, more natural to just see it as good looking, because that's what you'd see. But what does more natural mean in the context of Genesis and a story about the sons of God mating with human women? Nothing is natural about this here. So I tend to think that Kaminsky and Van Wolde and others' argument makes more sense, but you get to decide for yourselves of how that should be translated there. And so they took wives, and is that meant to be positive or negative? Well, some suggest, in light of the Garden of Eden story and the links here, that the man is to leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, and they become one flesh. That's the positive image of gender relations that are procreative. That the man and the woman are becoming one, just like the Adam was one until it was separated into an Ish, a man, and an Isha, a woman. So then, in sexual intercourse and intimacy, they become one body again. This taking here is certainly not suggesting consent or a mutuality that was there at the end of chapter 2. So it's suggesting at least a hostility involved there, at least a patriarchal act, if not an egalitarian act. How do we see verse 3 connected here? Because it certainly seems that Yahweh's speech here in verse 3 has nothing to do directly with what we see in the first couple of verses. But again, as suggested from the analogy with the Garden of Eden story and the curse in 3:22, there's certainly a parallel there between the woman's act in 3:6 and Yahweh's act in 3:22 with what we see more immediately connected here in 6:2 and 6:3. So again, that's something you can decide for yourselves. Very few scholars now accept what was the common rabbinical view, that the 120 years refers to the time between this moment in the story and the flood that is impending. There's no evidence to suggest that. They simply attribute the seeming inconsistency between the 120-year lifespan and the longer lifespans in Genesis, including Abraham's at 175, as noted there, as a function of different authors and nobody filling that right in. And we'll see there are clearly numerical inconsistencies when we look at the flood story, and we'll see how long the flood takes and how many animals of each kind are there. Those inconsistencies have been left there so that scholars who formed the original multiple source interpretation of Genesis, cut their teeth on the flood story, where it seems like most obvious that there are two stories left behind. We'll get to that pretty soon. So, continuing on here through this list of exciting questions that make this text, I think, fit in more than some scholars would allow. So what's the relationship of Yahweh's Spirit and humanity being flesh in 6:3, recalling Genesis 2:7? I'd suggest that what's at issue here, and to look at this, let's look at a couple of translation issues. My spirit, or ruach here, Yahweh's Spirit described in the first person is only here in the Pentateuch. It's often in common in later texts. Again, one of those things that suggests maybe it's from a later time period, but that's not enough in itself. Abide is probably not a good translation here, but it's a tough word to translate. The Hebrew Yadan is only here in the Hebrew Scripture, so there's a number of possibilities. One scholar is recently reviewing options, John Day, and suggesting that the word presupposes the verb danan from another language. I won't get into those details, and could mean strong or powerful. Hence, as you see in my note below, my spirit shall not be strong in man forever, implying mortality. So it's not a question of humans are not made of God's spirit and earth stuff, but that spirit will weaken because of human behavior. And some interesting quotes on that from various scholars about how this is a function of, as humans move away from God, God moves away from humans. And so we'll see more of that as we go through Genesis and its culmination in the Joseph story, where Joseph talks about God but has no direct relationship with God at all. So they are flesh, basar here. That is not what they were described originally. They're described as the topsoil afar, along with God's ruach. But now we see the word flesh here 33 times in Genesis and many, many times throughout the Hebrew Bible. This bodily stuff that humans are. Without God's Spirit, it goes back into the earth, as we know. Although we also have the option of Cain, who seems to at least turned away from paying attention to God's Spirit. I think the authors would suggest without that Spirit, Cain wouldn't be what we might think of as an atheist or agnostic. He'd be dead. So God's Spirit was still in Cain, whether he acknowledged it or not. What's being named here is the Spirit fading away at some point. So then we get to the Nephilim. And as I showed last time, there are many pop culture expressions of Nephilim today. The word, as I already said in this video, comes from a root meaning fallen ones, and that's what leads to the first Enoch interpretation of them as fallen angels. So if you grow up with a sense of Lucifer as a fallen angel, or the devil as a fallen angel, or Satan as a fallen angel, none of those terms are used in first Enoch, but they obviously are used in the Bible or in biblical related texts later. It comes not from Genesis here, and it doesn't come from the Bible at all. It comes from first Enoch, the story of the Watchers. We can see just a little taste of that here. We looked at this a little bit last time when we see here in that quote in the middle of the Watchers, otherwise known as angels, the sons of heaven saw these daughters of humans. And then that continues in that section of first Enoch, so-called Book of the Watchers, as describing how they wreak havoc on humanity and will eventually lead to the hope of relief from God from that, but that's for a much later story. And then finally, here we can see that these are related, the Nephilim are related to other tall people. As I noted last time, the Septuagint always translate this as gigas or gigantes, as giants. And there are certainly other reports of tall people in the Bible. Perhaps that's why verse 4 here has this extra phrase, and also afterward, raising the question of how did the Nephilim survive the flood? They weren't on the ark. Maybe they were just tall enough to be over the water. It doesn't say exactly how tall they are. But we know from 1 Samuel, of course, there are giants like Goliath, who's not described in the same language, but described in the language of cubits. But certainly the idea that some of the other peoples of the land were tall is one that was already existing in the exilic text that Genesis knew, and that's what we're probably seeing about the Rephaim in Deuteronomy 3:11, and maybe also about the Nephilim in Numbers 13:33, although the book of Numbers is a notoriously difficult text to date, probably consisting of a collection of traditions from various times, so we won't try to pin that down in time. So that's just a few things that I hope help us see that these 4 verses are actually tightly integrated into the Toledot that precedes it, and although some scholars disagree, I want to suggest at least part of the reason for the flood story that will emerge. We'll see next time in the most incredibly poignant verse in verse 5 that you can see already on your screen, that Yahweh saw the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their heart was only evil continually. So that'll be the beginning of setting up another reason for the flood, the evil of humanity. But as we'll see just a few verses farther down, just before the flood story, another reason is given in 6:11-12, which is that the earth has been corrupted, not only by humans, but by all flesh. It corrupted its ways upon the earth. So whether it's because of this joining of the sons of God, the Bene Ha-Elohim, with human women, that leads to the teaching of traditions that are about violence and power over and other gifts of the gods that are not meant for the humans, echoing like the Prometheus myths from Greek culture from a different time, or whether we see these as just simply a function of the historical context of the authors of Genesis, seeing the great leaders of their time, whether it's the kings of Babylon or Persia or later of Greece, as these powerful figures. We'll have to see as we continue. But in any event, we know that they recognized that there were humans who were powerful, and that would require them to have a strategy for how to respond to those powerful humans. And much of Genesis will, the family stories will show us how we engage, how the Israelites engage with the powerful people of empires and cities as they try to follow the way of Yahweh. All right, we'll move into the next section, the poignant, tragic passage 6:5-8 next time, where we hear Yahweh's regret that humans had even been made. See you.